Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Insight Podcast. My name is Stewart and I am the lead America's analyst at Sibylline. And today I'll be joined by Megan Sutcliffe, our analyst on the Middle East and Africa desk, to discuss ongoing hostilities between Israel and Lebanon as well as Iran. So Megan, we've seen quite a bit of escalation in recent days. I think let's start off just by trying to understand what is going on in Lebanon right now.
You are completely right, Sydney. The past few days have been incredibly hectic and have developed very, very quickly. But in essence, in the past few days, what we've seen is amid a substantial uptick in the frequency, the intensity, and also the range of Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon, both in southern Lebanon and in the capital, Beirut. On the 27th of September, we saw the IDF successfully assassinating Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Nasrallah led this organisation for 32 years and his death has been incredibly significant. Subsequently, on the 30th of September, we saw the IDF then launching ground operations in southern Lebanon.
So Megan, what are these ground operations aiming to do?
So in essence, what these ground operations are aiming to do corresponds to Israel's official war goal of returning displaced residents from the northern district to their homes. These are individuals who, because of the consistent rocket fire over the past year from Hezbollah targeting the northern district, have been evacuated. There are about 60,000 up to 70,000 people in Israel. And the government committed about a month ago officially to returning them to their homes. The government has said, as has the IDF, that this will not be possible unless they push Hezbollah's presence back behind the Litani River in southern Lebanon. Now, this river is approximately 30 kilometers from the border, and it has a substantial geopolitical significance because it was cited as the border of a buffer zone between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah following the conclusion of the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war. Despite this agreement, however, Hezbollah never fully implemented this agreement and never pulled back its forces behind this river. And particularly in the past 3 to 4 years, we've seen increasingly ostentatious shows of force and shows of their presence really right on the Israel-Lebanon border. The initial phases of the ground operation, as the IDF have stated, will aim to remove Hezbollah infrastructure, particularly from towns that are right on the Israel-Lebanon border.
So Megan, how have these operations proceeded thus far, and ultimately what is the objective?
So thus far, we've seen the IDF deploying at least 2 battalions into southern Lebanon. And in the past 24 hours, they have been engaging in ground combat with Hezbollah militants. This has led to at least 8 IDF casualties so far, 6 of whom died in an ambush and 2 of whom died in a mortar fire attack. This really highlights just how different operations in southern Lebanon are to the IDF's operations in Gaza. While the battalions that have been deployed have combat experience and recent combat experience in Gaza, they are incredibly different environments requiring different tactics and strategies. And so what we can expect from ground operations going forward is that they will be far more intense, they'll be far more costly, both in terms of military equipment, but also in terms of lives. In terms of the end goal, at present, the IDF continues to emphasize that these aim to be limited ground operations. They are not looking to establish, say, a permanent presence in southern Lebanon. But that being said, one of the primary concerns among the international community is that by launching these operations, by breaking the seal effectively on the Israel-Lebanon border, that there will be severe mission creep from the IDF and that this will lead to longer and more expansive operations. For example, in 1982, when the IDF went into southern Lebanon, the mission was only meant to last 96 hours, but we know there was an Israeli presence in Lebanon until at least the year 2000. This highlights the concern not only of regional powers, but particularly of the United States.
And as I understand it, Megan, southern Lebanon is also a territory that is very well known to Lebanese Hezbollah fighters and is therefore a very challenging operating environment for IDF. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Not only is southern Lebanon truly Hezbollah's stronghold, both in the south and Nabatea governorates, what we also know is that Hezbollah benefits from a substantial strategic depth based on their weapons caches, for example, in the Bekaa Valley, which is further north. This explains some of the airstrike patterns that we've seen in Lebanon by the IDF over the past week and a half. And it really points to how this will likely be an intense village-by-village combat, as opposed to one in which ground operations are quickly launched and then recalled after successfully achieving their goals.
So I guess this will definitely exacerbate any efforts on the behalf of Israel to make this a limited and brief military operation.
It will certainly be challenging.
So Megan, if we look sort of beyond the front in southern Lebanon, what are the likely costs to Israel of this military operation?
Well, at present, we've already seen the direct cost, of course, of sending 2 battalions into southern Lebanon. There's also been a significant increase in almost sustained rocket fire and drone incursions from Lebanese Hezbollah and its allies, but also Iranian proxies. Intercepting these munitions is, of course, costly for Israel, and some have deemed it to be an economic war of attrition, of constantly sapping resources by requiring repeated interceptions. When it comes to indirect costs, it's also worth noting that Israel has called up numerous reserve brigades, and this pulls individuals out of the workforce, just as we saw in the early days of the Israel-Hamas war. Taking individuals who have regular jobs and regular lives out of the workplace has an indirect cost. Based on these concerns, paired with a substantial increase in military spending but relatively stagnant economic activity, we've seen ratings agencies like Moody's and S&P downgrading Israel's credit rating based on longer-term fiscal concerns that almost certainly will continue impacting investor confidence and the operating environment.
So in the medium to long term, there will be very real economic consequences of sustained hostilities.
Absolutely.
And if we look to Lebanon, obviously there is a substantial issue with regard to internal displacement and also infrastructural damage. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So since the IDF has really ramped up operations in southern Lebanon, including the ground operations, we've seen numerous calls for evacuation. We've seen IDF spokespeople telling Lebanese residents not to operate their cars south of the Litani River. And this has really pushed hundreds of thousands of people to evacuate the southern governorates, but also areas of Beirut that are known to have a substantial Hezbollah presence. The latest available data at the time of recording indicates that about 250,000 individuals have been displaced or have evacuated their homes based on concerns that they will be caught up in this fighting, whether that is airstrikes or whether that is ground operations. Most of these individuals have moved north into governorates that are slightly more stable. Many have also moved to Beirut, and this has critically increased pressure on demand for public services and emergency services in a country that already has underfunded infrastructure and public services. Therefore, based on that, we are looking at a period likely of increased tensions between individuals hoping to access services, increasing physical security and bystander risk, particularly for NGO staff. But at the same time, when we look at Lebanon as a multi-confessional state and one that has a history of ethno-religious violence, continued displacement, tensions between displaced communities and receiving communities elevates risks of intercommunal clashes, and paired with broader economic instability, we are concerned about what that means for the stability of Lebanon in the long term.
So Megan, in parallel to escalating hostilities in southern Lebanon, there are high military and political tensions between Israel and Iran. What happened with the missile barrage the other day?
Absolutely. Sydney, I'm sure we all saw the footage of Iran launching over 180 ballistic missiles towards Israel on the 1st of October. This strike came after Israel launched, of course, its ground offensive in Lebanon several hours earlier, and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has said that this strike was in response to 2 events. Firstly, the alleged Israeli assassination of Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh in the Iranian capital of Tehran on the 31st of July, as well as Israel's assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah on the 27th of September.
So what did Iran target in Israel, and why did they strike?
So we saw Iran targeting or claiming to target at least 3 military bases within Israel, mainly in the southern district and in the central district. The IDF has confirmed that there was some minor material damage to these locations, but that they all remain operational. That being said, though, of course, 180 missiles is a significant barrage to be sending over, and there was video footage widely shared on social media of interceptions by Israel's numerous air defenses in the airspace above Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and other civilian population centres. At present, as far as we know, there has only been 1 death associated with this barrage, and that was of a Palestinian individual in the West Bank. And then we did see a few injuries in places like Tel Aviv due to falling shrapnel thanks to successful interception. Though this barrage did not necessarily have the most kinetic impact on the ground. The fact that Iran was willing to target Israel with this volume of ordnance is significant, and the rhetoric we've seen coming out of Israel over the past few days is certainly escalatory.
So with this escalatory rhetoric and substantial political momentum to respond within Israel, what is Israel going to do next?
When it comes to Israel's response, a direct strike on Iranian soil is highly likely. For many within Israel's government and military, it is a question not of if, but of when and what. What we're likely to see over the next few days is the Israeli government considering plans for how exactly to retaliate in Iran. And this is going to be a key question because the extent to which they target key infrastructure in Iran will inform, in turn, Iran's potential response and whether or not we are on course for a major and uncontrolled regional escalation.
So, Megan, what is our assessment on what is going to be targeted?
Well, there are several targets that Israel could select in order to retaliate for Iran's missile barrage. At present, we're assessing that the most likely targets would either be military infrastructure, whether that is military bases, airfields, potentially missile launching facilities, for example. But we're also looking at the likelihood of potential Israeli strikes on oil infrastructure, energy infrastructure, whether that is extraction, refinery, or indeed ports for the export of oil to partners like China.
So, Megan, what would be the broader global and strategic impacts of a strike on an Iranian oil infrastructure asset?
So, the impact of a strike on Iranian oil facilities, for example, it could have many implications. Firstly, we're looking at global oil markets. Although Iran is a heavily sanctioned nation and therefore does not export its oil to the majority of world countries due to US and other states as sanctions, at the same time, concerns about its production capabilities, but also broader regional stability in the event of such a strike would likely cause a period of price volatility on international oil markets. Secondly, depending on just how severe this strike was, if it made a tangible dent in Iranian oil production capacity, then that could well have implications for how Iran conducts its naval operations in the Strait of Hormuz. In the past, when we've seen Iran facing particular international pressure, there has been an uptick in piracy attempts or attempts to redirect vessels into Iranian ports, with some accusing the Iranian government of holding these vessels hostage. In the event of major damage to oil infrastructure, this could be something that we would see over the coming months. And then finally, when it comes to the longer term implications for Iran itself, it would have a significant economic impact for a country that already faces a high inflation and a rising cost of living and decreasing standards of living. But at the same time, in response to that, what we'd likely see is Iran becoming far more assertive in its support of its proxies to conduct strikes on Israel and a potential Iranian retaliation.
So, Megan, the big question on everybody's mind at the moment is, will Israel strike an Iranian nuclear target? Is this likely, and what would be the implications?
This is an incredibly important question. In the past, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon has acted as a form of deterrent against Israel conducting strikes against Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its uranium enrichment programs, because of its proximity to Israel and its significant missile and drone stocks. Because of this, it effectively stopped Israel from conducting these types of more assertive strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure. And now that Hezbollah is in a comparative period of weakness, potentially operational stasis, there are many commentators suggesting that the Israeli government is considering a strike on nuclear or nuclear-capable facilities within Iran. If this were to take place, this would form a major regional escalation. It would effectively commit Israel to a sustained period of hostilities with Iran. Based on this, we are forecasting that this is less likely than a strike on military or on oil or energy infrastructure. However, it remains a realistic possibility. It would also be an incredibly risky move from Israel, because we have to consider how exactly Iran's nuclear program works. Firstly, its uranium enrichment programs are located in its best defended locations, in the most hardened of sites, and it's unlikely that Israel will be able to penetrate and effectively wipe out these sites without the assistance of the United States, something that US President Joe Biden has said the US will not approve and will not assist with. So it would be very challenging to wipe out the most critical parts of Iran's nuclear program in the event of a direct strike. Even if they were to do that, though, and somehow successfully target these locations, it would be incredibly challenging, given how diffuse nuclear development activity is in Iran, to target each of those sites simultaneously and remove the technology needed to facilitate what Iran cites as its civilian nuclear energy power, which critics have, of course, called its nuclear weapon development program. But even if Israel could do all of that somehow, it would be incredibly challenging to actually remove the possibility of a nuclear weapon for Iran, because even if facilities are targeted and wiped out, the knowledge that was used to get Iran to the point where it is a potentially nuclear capable state will still remain. Those individuals are still there. That technological know-how is still in play. And rather, what strikes eliminating any nuclear infrastructure would do is likely harden Iran's resolve to develop that weapon. Therefore, it would be, in a sense, very counterintuitive for Israel to strike Iranian nuclear infrastructure. But at the same time, Iran does not yet have a nuclear weapon, and so more hardline members of Israel's government have likely called for a arguably more preemptive strike against this type of infrastructure, essentially before it is too late and before Iran has a nuclear weapon that it can deliver.
So, Megan, it is highly likely that Israel is going to respond with a strike, although the exact targeting is still yet to be seen. Nonetheless, what are the risks of a broader regional escalation right now?
All of that really hinges on what Israel does next and then how Iran responds to that. If Israel engages in a strike that Iran interprets as a major escalation, for example, something that does target nuclear-capable sites, one that does inflict major economic damage, then there is a significantly elevated risk that Iran will retaliate with further direct strikes. If we see direct strikes, it's another rung up the ladder of escalation for this region. We are also looking at a period of significantly elevated tensions between Israel and Iran's numerous regional proxies. This is not just limited to Lebanese Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and the ongoing ground operation, but also includes, for example, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, an umbrella organization of various Iranian-backed militant groups that operate throughout Lebanon and that have been increasingly targeting Israel with drone incursions into Israeli airspace. We've also seen increasingly direct hostilities between Israel and the Iran-backed but Yemen-based Houthis. Of course, this group is well known for having conducted numerous strikes targeting commercial vessels in the Red Sea since November last year. But particularly in the last month, we've seen a substantial uptick in the number of missile and drone strikes that have been targeting Israel. And to this end, last week, we saw Israel conducting airstrikes in the Al Hodeida port area, which also impacted several electricity generation facilities therein. The opening up of this front, in combination with operations in southern Lebanon and the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, we are truly getting to a point where many have commented that Israel is somewhat reaching a boiling point of being engaged in many different theatres with many different and very capable actors.
And no doubt this is going to also raise the pressure on the U.S. to help mitigate the risk that Israel's defenses will be overwhelmed. So that means, increased pressure and focus among U.S. naval and air assets throughout the entire Middle East, including the East Med, and also, assets near Yemen as well, to ensure safe passage of ships in the Red Sea and mitigate against the risk of further escalation and targeting of Israel.
Absolutely. And to this end, we saw US President Joe Biden authorizing the interception of Iranian missiles on the 1st of October when they were heading towards Israel. And it's highly likely that if we were to see further Iranian strikes, particularly drone strikes, which are a bit slower moving, that we would see the US taking on that role once again. In light of the upcoming US presidential election, which I know your desk is covering very thoroughly at the moment, it is incredibly delicate as a situation that remains extremely sensitive, not only to escalation triggers, but also potentially miscalculation of attacks, misinterpretation of attacks, triggering effectively a snowball effect into war that cannot be pulled back.
And certainly any major casualties of civilians in either Israel or Iran will further bolster that political and social pressure to respond with greater force, kind of exacerbating the possibility of a regional escalation.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much to our audience for joining us today, and indeed to Megan for her insightful analysis, as always. Please keep an eye out for our continued reporting as this unfolds, and you're welcome to join us as well on Mondays and Thursdays for our Middle East Crisis webinar. Details for that can be found in our show notes, and we'll see you on the next episode of Insight Podcast.